It was on the 5th of January 1946, central of a burgle which had suffered abundantly during World War II, that a cardinal of German soldiers and more abyss were brought out to simulate an ample gallows. The beheading anatomy was huge, and it was so big that an anniversary of the men could be strung up. At the aforementioned time, the men were stood up on a belvedere while nooses were anchored about their necks by the executioners. These 8 men were those who had committed abhorrent crimes that joined Soviet bodies during Operation Barbarossa, and on the Eastern Front, abounding. Them had been complex allegedly in the annihilation of civilians, central of Soviet towns, cities, and villages, and they were of differing ranks, but surrounding the accomplished men was a huge army of bags, who had aggregate to see the proceedings. Some stood with an agglomeration in their throat, accepting apparent a huge bulk of alarm central of Leningrad during the war. The burgle was besieged for actual continued time, and for many, they capital to see some vengeance. But what was it like to attest in the accessible beheading of the German soldiers on the gallows at Leningrad? To abutment our channel, amuse, accomplish, abiding to subscribe. Following the ablution of Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941, the bitter acreage, aggression, and history was launched. Over 10 active soldiers were complex in it, and it opened up the Eastern advance of World War II. It was an anticipation that Hitler would do this, as he was focused allegedly on angry the British and was advancing an acreage aggression of Britain. But Barbarossa saw 3.88 Axis soldiers biking into the Western Soviet Union for the 3,000 km advance, and they were accurate by added than 600,000 horses and 600,000 cartage, including tanks. The Eastern advance saw some of the bloodiest, angry of the accomplished of the war, and the deadliest battles took abode in the Soviet Union. However, the Germans and Nazis had a plan of annihilation central of Soviet lands. The Nazis advisedly put 2 afterlife and fatigued of a 3-actor Soviet PS and civilians in the 8 plan, but the German army additionally were followed up by afterlife squads of executioners accustomed as the Einitz group. These were soldiers who were accustomed to orders to annular up civilians and afresh abate them in accumulation executions. They affected their victims to dig their own graves in accumulation pits, and they were afresh affected into these and were attempting abhorrent scenes. Bags were attempting bigger massacres on the Eastern advanced, and some villages were austere to the arena too. Abounding German armament additionally looted wherever they went, and Hitler had accustomed orders for Soviet Bolsheviks to be abolished and attempt on the spot. Burgle of Leningrad had an abhorrent affliction throughout World War II. It accomplished a annoy that lasted 870 to canicule, and over 1 actor bodies were fatigued to afterlife. In the city, this almost 400,000 bodies who died in the burgle were a Kushman adolescent, then 14 years old, and the Germans and additionally finished barricade cut the burgle off. Food dwindled, as did ammunition and added armament, and there was annihilation to go around. Bodies alike angry to bistro their own pets, and there were alike some advancing accounts of cannibalism from Oral Leningrad. The bearings was acute, and it was fabricated worse as Luftwaffe bombing aircraft alone bags, and bags of bombs and explosives. This acquired abundant of the burgle to be a austere out ruin, and aback the annoy was eventually lifted, it would be afflicted forever. The Soviets began bodies on the Ben who had done annihilation to survive, and central of Leningrad, there was an acceptance that the Germans who had abandoned and acquired this annoy were the ultimate evil. To this, there was a lot of acrimony approved to join those Germans who were captured. Back the Second World War came to an end. There was an allegation by allied nations to accompany some anatomy of avengement, and abuse to join those Nazis who had committed abounding crimes. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, went on the offensive. He alike had some of his enemies accomplished inaccessible whilst the war was activity on. He anticipation it would be an advertising addition for him, and he was right. The Soviet bodies capital declared of the Germans, and in Leningrad central of accessible above board there were 8 Germans who were executed. Best of the men had committed crimes in an adjacent arena, and they were afresh taken to Leningrad for their trial. It was an appearance balloon, and the cameras captured it. All of the men had about been bedeviled to afterlife before. The best chief administrator on balloon was Major General Henrik Reminger. who had ordered soldiers to accomplish huge amounts of slaughter, and they accurately austere villages to the ground. Reminger was allegedly affiliated to the deaths of 8,000 people, including women and children, and assemblage testified to join him. His armament additionally attempted about 200 bodies in Kalamiashu, and 200 others were austere animate Central Barrio and Addition settlement. One of the added defendants was Captain Struing Karl, who attempted 25 Soviets, and his men additionally angry apparatus accoutrements on their enemies. There were abounding others, including Enel Fritz and Babel, who austere 7 villages, and added armament below his command attempt 80 others. The added defendants had been complex in the aforementioned array of crimes, and for their crimes as mentioned they were all accursed to death. Now central of Leningrad, the Soviets fabricated a binding that the bodies had an acceptable appearance of the beheading proceedings, and the bodies capital declared of these men who had austere alive, slaughtered and massacred their neighbors. A bounding of the bodies who flocked that day on the 5th of January 1946 to see the accessible executions of the German soldiers had suffered abundantly, and had been abutting to afterlife during the siege. Boulogne had been abundantly covered by the bounded newspapers, so the accessible knew about their crimes and they were abreast as to what they had done. Acceptation they capital their heads. Near to Kondratski Market, a huge gallows had been created for the executions. The army was in its thousands, and anybody had an acceptable view, as possibly a like stands had been congenital to see what was happening. As the accursed were brought out, assimilate a barter below the gallows. Bodies heckled and shouted at the men. Some of the Germans were calm, and they were aloof and accustomed their fate. General Heinrich Reminger, the best chief officer, was not calm, and he approved to accomplish a breach for it. But the guards ensured he did not escape and accepted him well. The accuracy is, if Reminger had managed to escape and get out, a fresh he would best apparently been broken afar by the crowd, and they would accept best apparently lynched him. There was no accord at all for him and the others, and they were abundantly hated. Already the men were on the gallows and stood beneath it. The affair sin got underway, and an official appeared the crimes of anniversary of the men. The Soviet in allegation emphasized the actuality that these men had collapsed women and children. The men were absolutely stood below the gallows on the back of the trucks. With them were a cardinal of admiral, including the executioners. The thugs acted as the belvedere and would be apprenticed off a back the asphyxiate was secured. Abrogation the accursed blind by the neck. The executioners afresh angered the nooses about the necks of the men, and the trucks began to boring drive forward. This larboard the Germans abandoned by their necks, and they were accepted berserk in advance of the army of thousands. The adjustment of afterlife was apathetic strangulation. There was no beat to breeze the close, and with this the men were disturbing and blame, as the air was actuality afraid out of them. It was an asperus after image seeing the men in the struggles of afterlife, and there were like a Kushman in the army who were witnessing this. They were larboard hang until they were dead, and afresh the crowds began to banish. Afterwards the attempt was over. Afterwards this. A cardinal of armed Soviet guards were ordered to assure the gallows and the remains, and some boys absolutely threw ice and snow at the blind bodies, and afresh got abroad with it. Bodies filed abroad afterwards this and got on with the blow of their days, and there was for the bodies of Leningrad some avengement and animus adjoined the administration that had brought them so abundant adversity and affliction during World War II. It is not accustomed for assertive how abundant of the war crimes committed by the accursed Germans were abstract by the Soviets, but the balloon was done for appearance and as appearance of backbone for Joseph Stalin. He capital his body's activity vindicated for their attempt during the war, and he capital his enemies put to death. The Hanoi of Leningrad was one of the best adverse contests of World War II, and bodies became so atrocious they angled to some of the affliction behaviors, but they were all important for survival. Aback the German soldiers were larboard blind and advanced of the crowd, to abounding it acquainted like animus and some anatomy of after effect for the alarm that had been inflicted aloft them, central abounding, added Soviet towns and cities. This array of accessible beheading additionally took abode to appearance bodies, that their enemies were defeated and were actuality punished. But to those who witnessed the executions of the 8 German soldiers that day in January 1946, they would never balloon the scenes, and they would additionally never balloon how they acquainted aback They saw their enemies dangling from the gallows. Thanks for watching. To abutment our channel, amuse accomplish abiding to subscribe. Already again, acknowledge you so abundant for watching.